So picture this. It's 4 in the morning. Rain's been hammering the city since midnight, and I'm sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold an hour ago and a neuroscience textbook open under a desk lamp that probably violated several fire codes. My apartment was the kind of place where you didn't have wasted room, not because of minimalism, but because I couldn't afford empty space. Narrow bed across the way, a sofa patched so many times it was basically a quilt, a TV I barely turned on, and 2 bookshelves leaning under the weight of anatomy, pharmacology, warehouse logistics, machine repair, construction, nutrition, agriculture, business management, psychology, martial arts, and medical terminology. My buddy Miguel once called it the library of a man who lost a fight with 10 careers at once, and honestly, fair. The textbook was about neuroplasticity and traumatic brain injury. I'd been underlining things in pencil like some kind of phantom student, except I'd never gotten into medical school and probably never would. Axons, synapses, memory formation, cortical mapping. The language fascinated me more than it should have for a guy who'd never stepped foot in a lecture hall. I checked the clock. 4:41. My shift started in less than 4 hours. Sleep would have been the smart move, but smart and I had a complicated relationship. Sometimes discipline didn't mean making the right choice. Sometimes it just meant surviving the consequences of the wrong one long enough to try again. The dream had been simple once. Become a doctor. Get into surgery. Specialize in neurosurgery. Not because of the money, though I'd be lying if I said it meant nothing growing up poor. It was fascination. The human brain was the last real frontier, sitting inside every skull, holding everything that made someone a person. I'd spent years studying the body, muscles, tendons, how things recovered. The more I learned, the more the nervous system pulled me in. Muscles obeyed signals. Reflexes bypassed thought. A fighter's reaction wasn't magic. It was biology refined into speed. And that idea had never stopped blowing my mind. My phone buzzed next to the cold coffee. Miguel. You awake, viejo? He'd been calling me old man since 19, mostly because I had the sleep schedule of someone trying to lose an argument with death. I typed back, unfortunately. He came back instantly with, studying again. I said that sounded like an accusation. He said it was one. Normal people slept before work. I pointed out normal people also complained about not knowing things. He said normal people lived longer. We'd met in a martial arts gym that smelled like old mats and ambition. He'd been loud and annoyingly cheerful even after getting punched. I'd been quieter and too analytical for my own good. Our friendship was built through bruises and the kind of trust you get from repeatedly trying to hit each other without malice. He asked about the gym tonight. My shoulder ached from last week and my back was tight from moving inventory at work. Once I would have trained through both. Back in my teens, martial arts and bodybuilding had been everything outside family. I'd studied hypertrophy, tendon adaptation, mobility, injury prevention, everything I could without paying for coaching. Built myself with the stubborn intensity of someone trying to prove at least his body could be something he controlled. Life took that away slowly, like it always does. I texted, maybe. He said that meant no. I said it meant maybe. He said no with guilt. I laughed, careful not to wake the neighbor. He said I always tried, and that was the problem. Miguel could hide concern inside humor so naturally you took the medicine before noticing the taste. A photograph on the shelf caught my eye. My mother in a park, wrapped in a blue coat, smiling despite looking completely spent. I stood beside her at 22, broader than, my expression somewhere between pride and worry. She'd insisted on the photo after a hospital appointment because the weather was good. I'd complained, because young men complain about things they'll later treasure. My father didn't appear in any recent photos. War took him when I was too young to understand absence. Adults used words like service and sacrifice. What I remembered was my mother staring at unpaid bills under the kitchen light, then smiling when I walked in like willpower alone could hide reality. She raised me alone. For years I thought strength meant enduring without bending. Later I realized my mother had been bending every single day, quietly, painfully, without ever letting me see how close she came to breaking. Her illness started as something manageable, then became something expensive, then became something that reorganized our entire lives around appointments, medication, work schedules, and the constant arithmetic of just getting by. I finished school with grades good enough to imagine university, but imagination didn't pay tuition. So I took work. First temporarily, then less temporarily, then long enough that the temporary path became the only path under my feet. I didn't resent her for that, and that mattered. Whenever bitterness tried to creep in, I pushed it away with almost physical force. My mother hadn't taken my opportunity. Circumstance had. Poverty had. Illness had. The indifferent machinery of a world where ability and access were too often strangers. She'd given me everything she could, and when there was nothing left, she still gave encouragement. After she died, when I was 23, the apartment became unbearably quiet. I learned then that grief didn't always show up as sobbing or collapse. Sometimes it showed up as unfinished habits. Buying medicine she no longer needed. Turning to share news with someone who wasn't there. Waking at night because the silence felt wrong. For months afterward I studied medicine harder than before, not because I thought knowledge could reverse death, but because ignorance had become intolerable. The rain kept going. The city brightened slowly. I read until the alarm rang at 6:15, showered, dressed, packed leftovers into a plastic container, and pulled on work boots worn smooth along the edges. Before leaving I grabbed the neuroscience book even though I knew I probably wouldn't have time. Carrying it felt irrational. I carried it anyway. The hallway smelled like damp concrete and frying onions. Mrs. Parker from the 7th floor was wrestling with a torn trash bag near the stairwell. 70s, proud enough to reject help before it was offered. Kind enough to leave food outside neighbors' doors when she thought they were struggling. I took the bag from her without asking. She told me I was going to miss my bus. I said probably. She said I always said that like it didn't matter. I said it mattered, just less than cleaning garbage off the stairs. She gave me the look, that suspicious elderly woman glance deciding whether gratitude would encourage future interference. Then she said I should have been a doctor. I tied the torn plastic into a knot and said that wouldn't have saved her trash. She said it might have saved my sleep. I said unlikely. She watched me carry the bag down 2 flights, then called after me that my mother would tell me to eat more. I stopped for half a second, then kept going. She usually did. The bus pulled away exactly as I reached the stop. I stood under the shelter while rainwater dripped off the roof edge and pooled near my boots. A younger version of me might have cursed. The current version just checked the schedule, calculated the delay, and accepted that kindness had cost me 12 minutes. There were worse prices to pay. Work started at 8 in a logistics warehouse serving repair contractors, construction suppliers, and medical offices. My title changed depending on who needed what. Inventory coordinator on paperwork. Warehouse manager when things were smooth. Mechanic when machines broke. Convenient problem solver when supervisors wanted responsibility to land somewhere specific. The place smelled of wet cardboard, machine oil, and burnt coffee. Printer jammed twice before 9. By 10:30, medical supplies arrived with mismatched labels, so I was cross-checking order numbers while a delivery driver complained about having 3 more stops and 0 patients for accountability. Carlos, the forklift operator, laughed from behind a pallet. 47, good with engines, terrible with vegetables, convinced every workplace needed better tools or louder profanity. He said if I'd gone to medical school I could argue with doctors instead of delivery guys. I said doctors had better vocabulary. He said same ego. I said probably better handwriting than him. He called it cruel but accurate. By noon the shipment problem was a paperwork problem, and by mid-afternoon that was a supervisor problem. I handled most of it because systems failed less from one big mistake than from many small ones nobody wanted to own. Wrong label, delayed delivery, angry clinic, contract issue. Chains of consequences wearing the mask of minor inconveniences. At lunch I sat near the loading bay with the textbook next to my rice and chicken. For pages in Miguel called, asked if I was alive. I said people kept asking. He asked if I was okay. I said tired. He said I always said tired. I said it was often true. He said no, I said tired when I meant something else. I told him I'd been reading about traumatic brain injuries. He asked why. I said recovery after brain injury still felt almost impossible. Two patients with similar damage, completely different outcomes. Patterns but not enough control. He asked if I still thought about becoming a neurosurgeon. I closed the book. A reasonable man at 30, no university, no money, no clear path, should have buried that dream years ago. I said yes. He told me not to say it like I was confessing a crime. I said it was less practical than crime. He said it sounded more like me. The rest of the day dragged. A lift gate broke. A supervisor found something urgent that had been urgent since last week. Carlos cut his hand on a metal edge and insisted it was nothing until I cleaned it, checked the depth, and told him tetanus didn't care about masculine pride. By clock out, the storm had turned cold and slanting. I considered the gym. My phone showed 3 missed messages from Miguel and a photo of a boxing glove pointed at the camera like an accusation. I typed, "Tomorrow." He responded before I reached the next block. Liar. The walk home past restaurants glowing behind fogged windows, a pharmacy where I'd once worked weekends, and a clinic whose back office still showed up in my dreams as stacks of forms and ringing phones. Every place held an old version of me. Near the grocery store, the light turned red. I stopped under a closed flower shop's awning. A woman ahead of me juggled grocery bags and a phone. Beside her, a kid in a yellow raincoat hopped between painted lines on the sidewalk, clutching a plastic dinosaur. I noticed the untied shoelace. I noticed the delivery truck coming from the left. The speed. The light changed. People crossed. The kid dropped the dinosaur. It bounced, slid across the wet crosswalk. The boy lunged after it with that blind urgency kids have before they learn how fast ordinary moments can break. The truck's brakes screamed. The mother turned. I moved before thought finished forming. Training and instinct compressed into one motion. I covered the distance, reached the kid by the back of his raincoat, and threw him toward the sidewalk. The truck hit me before I could turn. The impact erased everything. Pain came first, vast and white. Then sound collapsed into silence. Rain on my face. Streetlights stretching in long lines. Someone screamed for an ambulance. Someone kept saying I'd save the boy. I tried to breathe. My body refused. That irritated me in some distant corner of my mind. A small shape appeared near my fading vision. Yellow raincoat. Crying face. Alive. Relief before fear. The city started pulling away. Pain dulled from distance, not healing. I thought of Miguel's boxing glove photo, Carlos by the forklift, Mrs. Parker, my mother in the park, the textbook in my bag. Curiosity came last. Not hope. Not terror. Curiosity. What happens now? The question sat there, fragile and stubborn and mine. Then I felt something beyond the failing body. So death wasn't what I expected. I figured it would be clean. A final thought, a final breath. Then nothing. I'd spent enough nights beside hospital beds to understand that fear didn't negotiate with reality. Machines stopped. Bodies failed. People left behind photographs, debts, and unfinished conversations. Death was always brutal because life just kept going without asking permission. But the darkness after the truck wasn't nothing. There was no body, no pain, no rain on my face. Without sensation, time lost meaning. I tried counting seconds and failed because seconds need change. I tried remembering the accident in order, but memory drifted in pieces. Yellow raincoat, wet asphalt, Miguel's last message. The kid alive at the edge of my vision. What bothered me was the absence of fear. A man could understand panic. Panic belonged to the body. Racing pulse, tightening throat, chemical alarms in the blood. This was different. I had no pulse to race, no lungs to tighten. Thought kept going without the machinery that made thought possible. And the contradiction sat there like an equation missing half its symbols. Maybe it was just the final dream of a damaged brain. That was comfortable for a while. Neural activity under trauma could produce strange experiences. Oxygen deprivation could distort perception. The mind might build one last place to stand before everything collapsed. Then the darkness changed. It didn't brighten. No tunnel. No voice. The emptiness developed depth. Like I'd been inside a room and only just realized the room was part of an ocean. Something vast existed beyond me. No shape, but the scale pressed against my awareness with terrifying gentleness. I had no language for it, and for once the absence of language felt honest. I didn't pray. I'd never been someone who spoke easily about faith, though I hadn't mistaken silence for disbelief either. My mother once said some truths became smaller when spoken to people who only wanted to win debates. If there was a creator behind existence, I'd never imagined understanding him would be simple enough to fit inside human certainty. The vastness didn't explain itself. It simply remained. Eventually another sensation emerged from the dark, and this one was worse. Warmth. Faint at first, then surrounding, then impossibly close. Pressure followed. Then movement around me, rhythm and pulse and muffled vibration. A heartbeat sounded through the world. Not distant, not observed. A heartbeat large enough to become an environment. My thoughts sharpened. That's when panic arrived. I tried to move and something moved with me, small and weak and horribly unfamiliar. Hands so tiny that using them felt absurd. The space around me pressed from every direction, warm and confined, and muffled voices came distorted through fluid and flesh. I'd read about fetal development years earlier helping a coworker with hospital paperwork. The memory hit with clinical clarity and emotional impossibility. No. First complete thought. No, this can't be what it seems. Reality didn't ask for agreement. Time moved in fragments. Sometimes I drifted, submerged in a body too young for sustained awareness. Sometimes muffled voices reached me. Sometimes the heartbeat accelerated and I felt emotions not my own ripple through the body carrying me. Each explanation felt insane. Each fit better than denial. Birth came as violence. The warm world tightened until pressure erased thought. Instinct took over before I could protest. The space contracted, shifted, expelled. Sound grew louder. Cold appeared as a concept before becoming a sensation. Light struck through closed eyes. Hands caught me, turned me, cleared something from my mouth. For one instant the body didn't breathe. Then air entered. The shock was unbearable. I cried. Not from sadness or fear, but because the new body demanded announcement. The sound was thin, furious, helpless, and humiliating. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed through exhaustion, and the emotion reached me more clearly than words. The language was unfamiliar. That frightened me almost as much as the body. Voices carried rhythm, urgency, relief, but meaning wouldn't attach. I'd worked around enough languages to know the difference between unfamiliar speech and noise. This was speech. It had structure. I just didn't know it. Hands wrapped me in rough cloth. The texture scratched against skin too sensitive for the world. Smoke in the air, mixed with herbs, sweat, warmed water. No antiseptic. No plastic. No machines. A face appeared above me, blurred beyond recognition. The woman holding me was exhausted enough that her eyelids trembled. Yet she smiled with a softness that cut through all the confusion and reached something older inside me. Her voice lowered when she spoke to me, and while the words meant nothing, the feeling did. Mother. The word came from instinct, memory, and grief at once. I tried to resist it. I failed. This woman wasn't my mother from Earth. The woman in the blue coat, the one who said good weather shouldn't be wasted, was gone. But this new body didn't know philosophy or grief or boundaries between lives. It knew warmth. It knew heartbeat. It knew the person holding it safely. A larger shadow approached. A man's voice, deep and rough. He spoke carefully, like he was trying to control emotion through volume. When his hand touched the cloth near my head, the fingers were broad, calloused, and hesitant in the way strong men get around fragile things. She said something to him. He answered, and the room eased. Father. The word arrived slower. With it came a memory of my own father lifting me in arms that smelled of metal, dust, and soap, a memory so old it was less image than sensation. War took that man before I could know him. Now another father stood above me, alive, present, trembling slightly while pretending not to. The newborn body burned through energy fast. Thoughts blurred. Light softened. I tried to stay awake because sleeping felt like surrendering the only control I had. But infancy didn't negotiate. The world faded around the sound of the woman's heartbeat, and for the first time since the truck, I slept without dreams. Days became a series of sensations. Hunger arrived like catastrophe. Cold became betrayal. Warmth became salvation. Sleep came without permission and left without warning. The body couldn't lift its head, couldn't focus its eyes, couldn't coordinate fingers beyond weak curling. I'd once managed warehouses, repaired engines, studied anatomy, argued with insurance clerks until they regretted answering. Now I couldn't even turn over. But even helplessness taught things. The house was timber. I learned that by smell and sound. Beams shifted during cold nights. Wind pressed against shutters. Firewood cracked in a hearth that served as the center of everything. The floor creaked under different footsteps, and eventually I started identifying people by movement. My mother moved lightly but never carelessly. My father walked with weight through his heel, steady. Another child ran more than walked, constantly corrected by adults. A second child moved with quicker steps and often approached the cradle uninvited. Siblings. That came before faces cleared. The older girl visited constantly. Bright voice, impatient, the natural authority of a child who believed younger creatures existed partly for her inspection. She'd lean over the cradle and talk at length in words I didn't understand, pausing like she expected a response. When none came, she continued. I suspect she enjoyed both sides. The boy was more cautious. He approached after the girl had already declared something loud enough to draw adults from across the room. His voice was quieter. Sometimes he placed wooden figures near the cradle in patterns I couldn't properly see. Once he offered a small carved animal and looked disappointed when the baby couldn't take it. I wanted to explain that motor control required development. I drooled instead. Weeks passed before vision cleared enough for faces to separate from colors. My mother's name came first because everyone spoke it constantly. Lena. Younger than I expected, older than she looked when she smiled. Black hair usually braided over one shoulder, loose strands escaping by evening. Her face had a quiet beauty shaped by endurance rather than softness. Pale gray eyes with a faint silver cast that caught firelight strangely. Those eyes missed very little. Even exhausted, she noticed small discomforts before they became cries. My father was Gareth. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired. Weathered by outdoor life in a way no office worker on Earth ever became. Hands scarred from tools or weapons. He smelled of forest whenever he came home. Pine resin, leather, cold air, damp earth, and occasionally blood. I first assumed farmer or laborer. Then I noticed the bow near the door, the knives maintained with quiet care, carcasses brought home beneath canvas. Hunter. Not hobby hunter. Survival hunter. That distinction mattered. No electricity. No running water. No distant engines at the edge of hearing. Night was truly dark beyond fire and lamp. Winter, when adults spoke of it, carried the tone people on Earth reserved for debt, illness, and war. The village outside introduced itself through sound. Frostwood, though I didn't know the name yet. Axes in the mornings. Dogs barking at carts. Chickens complaining with impressive consistency. Sometimes horns or bells sounded far beyond the house, and the entire atmosphere shifted until Gareth took up weapons before leaving. Language became my first project. Infants learned naturally, but my adult mind brought real attention to the process. At first speech was just sound. Then clusters formed islands. Lena meant mother. Gareth meant father. Alara was the bright girl with relentless commentary. Darren was the cautious boy who left wooden animals by the cradle. Food, fire, sleep, cold, door, water. Meaning attached slowly, then faster. The language wasn't English, though my thoughts still formed in it. Harder sounds in some places, softer in others, grammar suggesting cases and endings. For a man who'd spent his life learning from fragments, listening was enough to begin. One evening, maybe a month after birth, a storm rolled in. Rain struck the roof in heavy sheets. Lena sat near the hearth with me while Gareth repaired a leather strap. Alara and Darren were quieter than usual, because storms made even children aware of shelter. The conversation turned toward me. All four looked my direction. Names appeared among the unfamiliar words. I'd wondered what they'd call me. Adam couldn't remain. Adam White had died beneath rain and streetlights. That life, with its unpaid bills and Miguel's jokes and my mother's photograph, belonged to another world. It hadn't vanished. It lived in memory. But this body needed a name from this place, spoken in this language. Lena looked down at me. Her expression changed. Nothing dramatic. No prophecy entered the room. No sign in the fire. She studied the child with the solemn tenderness of a mother choosing a word she hoped would carry him safely forward. Cashin, she said. The room went still. Gareth repeated it once, slower, testing its weight. Alara said it with approval, then again like she was already planning variations. Darren spoke it quietly. Lena smiled. Cashin. The name didn't belong to Earth or the man who died. It belonged to this child beside a hearth in a frontier house beneath an unfamiliar sky. Grief and hope touched inside me without canceling each other. I didn't choose the name. I accepted it. The baby yawned, ruining whatever dignity the moment might have held. Lena laughed softly and drew the blanket higher. Gareth returned to the strap, though his eyes kept drifting toward the cradle. The storm continued outside, but inside was warmth and smoke and the fragile beginning of a life I'd never expected. My last thought before sleep wasn't a question or fear. It was a decision, small and quiet, from what remained of a man who'd once lived without enough opportunity and now found himself surrounded by impossibility. This time I'd learn everything I could. My first few years in Frostwood passed slowly enough that I sometimes wondered if time itself had gotten heavier in this world. Infancy had been a prison of soft blankets, helpless limbs, and humiliating dependence. Toddlerhood improved things only slightly. I could move but poorly. I could speak but not with the precision my thoughts demanded. I could understand far more than anyone expected. Yet I had to hide all of it beneath clumsy words, childish questions, and the occasional deliberate mistake. The hard part wasn't pretending to be a child. The hard part was remembering that I truly was one now, at least in every way that mattered to the people around me. By the time I turned 3, I could walk steadily, speak clearly, and follow conversations without struggling. That last part created problems. Kids were supposed to misunderstand adult stuff, get bored during long discussions, ask about food or toys or whether they could go outside. I asked those questions when necessary, but my attention kept drifting toward the machinery beneath life. In Frostwood, that machinery was everywhere. It was in how villagers stored grain before winter, how hunters distributed meat after a successful trip, how Lena dried herbs above the hearth, how Gareth checked every strap and buckle before entering the forest. Frostwood itself was small by the standards of my old memories, but it had enough complexity to keep me occupied from sunrise to sleep. The village sat where thick northern forests met rough farmland. Timber houses, smoke-darkened roofs, fenced animal pens, muddy footpaths, and people who measured prosperity in full pantries rather than coin. Beyond the outer homes, the trees pressed close, tall and old, their branches whispering in winds carrying pine resin, damp soil, animal musk, and wood smoke. In summer, the forest seemed generous. In winter, people spoke of it differently. That difference mattered. I learned early that Frostwood wasn't just poor or remote. It was exposed. Every family understood that a bad harvest, a failed hunt, a sickness, or an early frost could become a disaster. Earth had poverty too, brutal and familiar, but modern cities hid danger beneath systems. Hospitals, electricity, plumbing, supply chains, emergency services, laws, stores filled with food shipped from places most buyers never imagined. Frostwood had systems, but smaller and more fragile. A roof leaked until someone fixed it. Meat spoiled unless preserved correctly. A wound became serious if herbs failed or infection spread. If monsters came from the forest, no siren would bring trained responders. People survived because they knew how to survive. I respected that. I watched everyone because every person carried knowledge shaped by necessity. The blacksmith knew iron by color and sound. The carpenter knew which timber bent and which split under stress. Old women sorting vegetables could judge storage quality faster than a merchant could count coins. Hunters read broken grass, disturbed mud, bent twigs, distant bird calls, and smells carried by wind. Children learned chores before letters because chores kept houses alive. Letters, unfortunately, were far rarer than chores. That became one of my first major frustrations. Language had come quickly because a child's mind absorbed sound with frightening efficiency, especially guided by adult attention. Reading didn't come as easily because books were scarce and paper expensive. Frostwood had no schoolhouse in any way I'd have recognized. Some families taught letters at home if they knew them. Traveling clerks passed through occasionally. Merchants carried ledgers. The village headman had documents locked in a chest. Lena could read common script well enough for medicinal notes and recipes. Gareth could handle practical markings and contracts, though he hated doing it for long. Alara read best among the kids, a fact she used both responsibly and tyrannically. One cloudy afternoon near the end of early summer, I found her sitting beside the hearth with a thin booklet across her lap. She was 11 by then, tall for her age, bright-eyed, dark-haired like our mother, and entirely convinced that being the eldest made her a secondary authority in the household. The booklet was Lena's, containing herbal notes copied from someone else's notes decades earlier. Pages worn soft at the corners, sections marked with thread. I approached carefully, carrying a carved wooden horse Darren had made for me and which I had zero intention of actually playing with. Alara. She didn't look up. No. I said I hadn't asked yet. She said I'd used her name like that. It meant I wanted something. I considered denying it, then decided the evidence was against me. I asked her to read that part again. She said I'd already heard it twice. I said I forgot. Alara finally looked up, narrowing gray eyes that resembled Lena's but lacked Lena's patience. She said I didn't forget things. I pretended to forget when I wanted people to repeat them. Inconveniently accurate. I held up the wooden horse like it strengthened my argument. Please. Alara stared at me for several seconds. You are strange. I said Darren said that too. She said Darren was right. Then she sighed in the theatrical manner of someone who wanted her sacrifice recognized by future generations and looked back at the page. Fine. But if Mother asked why the kindling wasn't stacked, she was telling her I'd delayed her. I sat down immediately. She began reading slowly, running one finger beneath the words. The passage described fever leaf, a plant used to reduce high temperatures when boiled correctly. I listened to the pronunciation, watched the movement of her finger, and compared repeated symbols against repeated sounds. The script used curved letters with small marks indicating altered vowels. Several patterns were already familiar. I couldn't read independently yet, but the structure was no longer a mystery. Halfway through, Alara stopped. You are not listening to the story. I said it wasn't a story. She said I knew what she meant. I said I was listening. She said I was watching her finger. I looked at the page, then at her. The marks repeat. She blinked. Letters repeat. That's how writing works. I said I knew. She said I was 3. I had no good answer to that. Before she could keep interrogating me, Darren came in carrying an armful of split wood. 7 years old and already imitating Gareth's quiet steadiness, though his limbs still belonged to a boy growing faster than his coordination could manage. He placed the wood near the hearth and noticed the booklet. He made you read again? Alara pointed at me. He is trying to learn letters without admitting it. Darren considered this with the grave seriousness of someone deciding whether a crime had occurred. Is that bad? It's annoying. That's not the same. I appreciated Darren's logic. Alara did not. The argument that followed contained no useful information beyond confirming that sibling dynamics remained remarkably consistent across worlds. I listened anyway because people revealed themselves most clearly when arguing over small things. Alara's complaints hid affection. Darren's quiet replies hid amusement. Both treated me as their little brother, not as Adam, not as some impossible reincarnated mind, not as a secret adult trapped inside a child's body. That simplicity was comforting in ways I found difficult to admit. Lena returned before things could escalate into thrown cloth. She came in carrying a basket of herbs gathered from the southern slope beyond the village, black hair braided over one shoulder, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The smell of crushed leaves entered with her, sharp and green. One glance told her nearly everything. Alara. The kindling is still outside. Alara immediately pointed at me. He delayed me. Lena looked toward me. I arranged my face into innocence. Lena smiled in a way that suggested innocence had failed. Did he? Alara said I wanted her to read Fever Leaf again. Lena asked if I was forgetting already. I hesitated a fraction too long. Darren laughed quietly. Lena set the basket on the table and began sorting herbs into smaller bundles. She told me to come help her separate them. Alara got kindling duty. Darren got hand-washing duty. He obeyed without grumbling, which I considered more efficient and less entertaining. I climbed onto the bench beside her and looked across the spread of leaves, roots, stems, and small flowers. Some had been tied already with thin thread. Others lay loose, waiting to be cleaned. Lena placed 3 leaves in front of me, one long and pale green with serrated edges, one rounder and darker, one narrow with a purple vein running through the center. She asked if I remembered which was Fever Leaf. I pointed to the pale serrated one. Her eyebrows rose slightly. And this one? Bitterroot. What did it do? I had to be careful. Saying too much would create questions. Saying too little wasted opportunity. Stomach pain. She said that was close enough. Then she put the purple-veined leaf in front of me. I studied it. The scent was faintly sweet with something metallic beneath. I said I didn't know it. Good, she said. It was better to say that than guess. Lena's voice softened as she separated several stems. This was widow's thread. It helped slow bleeding when prepared correctly, but too much could make someone very sick. That caught my attention. I asked how. She looked at me, perhaps hearing the sharpness beneath the childish voice. How what? How did it slow blood? Most mothers might have laughed. Lena didn't. She studied me for a moment instead, eyes thoughtful. She didn't know the deep reason. Her mother taught her it thickened blood when ground with salt ash and boiled. Her mother's mother had taught her the same. Some things they knew because they'd worked long enough to be trusted. That answer would have frustrated Adam. Cashin found it useful. Empirical knowledge without theory was still knowledge. Primitive didn't mean foolish. Many discoveries on Earth had begun as repeated observation long before anyone understood the mechanisms. If widow's thread affected coagulation, then this world's plants contained biochemical properties worth studying. A memory surfaced briefly, me standing behind a pharmacy counter years earlier during a slow shift, reading ingredient labels while the pharmacist explained why some patients feared medicines they didn't understand but trusted herbs they understood even less. Familiarity often disguised ignorance. The memory faded when Lena touched my cheek with 2 fingers. You became quiet. I said I was thinking. She said I did that often. I said thinking was useful. She smiled, but something in her eyes stayed observant. She said thinking could also make children forget they were children. I lowered my gaze to the herbs. She didn't press further. That was one of the things I loved about her, though I didn't yet have the courage to think the word love without feeling the ache of Adam's mother behind it. Lena noticed too much, but she rarely forced answers before people were ready. Gareth returned that evening just before sunset. I heard him before seeing him. The outer door opened with a familiar scrape, followed by the heavier step of boots carrying forest mud. Cold air entered despite the season, along with scents of pine, leather, sweat, and fresh blood. Darren looked up first. Alara emerged from the storage corner. Lena's shoulders eased slightly, the way they always did when Gareth came back from the forest alive. He wasn't alone. 2 other hunters accompanied him to the yard, helping unload a creature I'd never seen before. It resembled a deer only in the most generous sense. Its body was taller and leaner than any deer from Earth, with gray-brown hide stretched over powerful muscle. The antlers curved backward in branching arcs, their tips faintly blue near the ends. Most striking were the veins visible beneath the skin along its neck and flank, thin lines that occasionally pulsed with pale light. I stepped closer despite myself. Gareth noticed and set one hand against my chest before I could get too close. Careful. Still kicks after death sometimes. I looked up. It is dead. He said it disagreed for a while. One of the hunters laughed. Smart boy, but he doesn't know Storm Deer yet. Storm Deer. The name lodged inside my mind. As the men worked, faint blue sparks danced once across the antlers and vanished. Nobody else reacted strongly. Darren watched with interest. Alara complained about the smell. Lena began preparing cloth and knives for processing. To them, the sparks were unusual perhaps, but not impossible. To me, they were a crack in the foundation of reality. I kept my voice careful. Why does it glow? Gareth wiped his knife on a cloth. Because it's a storm deer. I waited. No further explanation came. That was apparently the entire answer. I tried again. What made the light? The bearded hunter, a broad man with a thick beard and a scar near his chin, shrugged. Storm in the blood, folk say. Gareth gave him a dry look. Folk said many things after enough ale. The bearded hunter grinned. Didn't mean all of them were wrong. Lena, who'd begun separating tools, said the antlers were useful if ground properly. Traders paid for them when the glow held. Some mages used them. The word entered the yard quietly. Mages. I didn't move. Inside, my thoughts accelerated. I'd suspected strange phenomena existed in this world. The lack of technology, the unfamiliar animals, the way villagers spoke of certain dangers, the faint things I sometimes sensed in places I couldn't explain. All of it suggested this reality differed from Earth in more than geography. But suspicion and confirmation weren't the same. A glowing animal could be biology, chemistry, radiation, bioluminescence, electrical discharge, unknown mineral interaction. But mages? That word carried implications no rational mind could ignore. I looked at Lena. What is a mage? The adults paused for only a moment, but I noticed. Gareth resumed cutting first. Someone who uses magic. The answer was so direct I almost forgot to maintain a child's expression. I asked what magic was. The bearded hunter laughed. Creator spare us, Gareth. The boy had found the questions that made old men tired. Gareth shook his head, though amusement touched his mouth. Magic was magic. Some people could use it. Most couldn't. Best not to trouble my head over it yet. That was maybe the least satisfying answer I'd ever received. Lena gave Gareth a look. He sighed. She said I'd asked. He said I asked everything. She said to answer better. The bearded hunter laughed harder. Gareth looked mildly betrayed by his own wife, then crouched so he could speak closer to my height. His face was weathered from sun and wind, his eyes dark and steady. He smelled of forest and blood, and yet his voice was gentle enough that I felt something unexpected in my chest. Magic was power some people could shape, he said slowly. Mages used words, signs, tools, or training to make things happen that ordinary hands couldn't. Fire without flint, light without lamp, wounds closing faster, water moving where it shouldn't. Things like that. I absorbed every word. I asked if he could do it. He laughed. No. Could Mother? No. Could Alara? Alara, who'd been listening from near the doorway, lifted her chin. If she could, she'd have used it on Darren by now. Darren said that was why she couldn't. Lena said their names in a tone that ended the argument before it began. I looked back at the storm deer. The blue veins had dimmed further after death, but traces of light remained near the antlers. Power some people could shape. Fire without flint. Wounds closing faster. Water moving where it shouldn't. The concepts rearranged themselves inside my mind, colliding with every memory Adam had carried from Earth. If magic existed, then medicine changed. Engineering changed. Agriculture changed. Combat changed. Energy production changed. Every limitation required review. Every assumption became provisional. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay beneath a wool blanket in the small sleeping space I shared with Darren, listening to the house settle around me. Gareth and Lena spoke quietly in the next room. Alara turned in her sleep somewhere beyond the partition. The hearth had burned low, leaving the room dim and warm. Through a gap in the shutters, I could hear wind moving across frostwood. carrying distant sounds of dogs, creaking timber, and forest life beyond the village edge. Magic existed. The thought should have been impossible. Instead, it explained too much. I lifted one small hand beneath the blanket and stared at it in the darkness. The fingers were short, soft, and clumsy compared to Adam's hands. They'd never held a scalpel, repaired a machine, thrown a punch, lifted weights, or carried my mother's medicine. They belonged to a child in a dangerous world that didn't know electricity but knew mages, storm deer, monsters, and forests people treated with respect bordering on fear. For the first time since rebirth, I felt something stronger than confusion, grief, or cautious acceptance. Possibility, not destiny, not certainty, not foolish excitement without fear. Possibility. If magic followed rules, then it could be studied. If it could be studied, it could be understood. If it could be understood, then perhaps it could be improved, refined, and applied in ways this world hadn't yet imagined. I closed my hands slowly. A 3-year-old body could do very little. For now, I turned onto my side and forced my breathing to slow. Tomorrow I'd listen more carefully, ask fewer questions openly and better questions privately. Learn the letters. Learn the village, the forest, the plants, the animals, the dangers, and the rules behind magic if rules existed at all. Adam White had lived 30 years gathering experience without enough opportunity to use it fully. Cashin had been given a world where opportunity might be hiding inside the impossible. I intended to find it. By the time I reached my 4th year, I'd learned that Frostwood wasn't poor because its people lacked intelligence. The village was poor because intelligence alone didn't create opportunity, and opportunity was one of the rarest resources on the frontier. Hunters could read forests the way clerks read contracts. Farmers estimated weather from wind, clouds, bird calls, and the smell of soil. Lena could identify dozens of plants by texture alone. Gareth could repair a roof, track an injured stag across frozen ground, judge leather strength by touch, and speak just enough with merchants to avoid being cheated too badly. On Earth, I'd met educated fools and uneducated geniuses often enough to stop confusing schooling with intelligence. Frostwood reinforced that lesson every day. Most villagers didn't have libraries or tutors, but they carried the kind of practical understanding that survived because people without it died early. Their knowledge was narrow because life forced it to be narrow, not because their minds were small. The question of knowledge occupied me on a rainy afternoon while I sat beside Alara near the hearth. The day had been too wet for outdoor chores. Darren sat near the wall carving a block of soft wood into something that might become a fox if his patience survived. Lena worked at the table sorting dried leaves. Gareth had gone to help repair a storage shed and hadn't returned yet. Alara sat with a thin booklet across her lap. At 11, she'd already begun resembling Lena in ways that made Gareth uncomfortable whenever village boys looked at her too long. The booklet belonged to Lena and everyone treated it with the care usually reserved for sharp tools and newborn animals. Its binding had been repaired repeatedly with thread. Some pages were nearly transparent from generations of fingers. I asked her to read the old hunter story again, leaning closer than necessary while pretending not to study the letter shapes. She lowered the booklet just enough to reveal suspicion. I didn't care about the old hunter. I cared about the words. She said when people listened to stories they looked at the reader, but I looked at the marks like they'd insulted me. Darren laughed so suddenly his knife slipped and ruined one of the fox's ears. I maintained a careful expression of sympathy. Alara saw through me at once. I said I was learning. She said I was 3. I said I was almost 4. She said that didn't make it less strange. Lena's hands kept moving through the herbs, but amusement softened her face. She said, "Let me learn." Strange questions were less troublesome than strange silences. Alara turned toward her mother with the betrayed expression of a commander abandoned by reinforcements. Lena admitted some of my questions were useful. Alara sighed dramatically enough for the entire house and resumed reading. This time I listened to the story and followed the letters simultaneously. When she finished, I stayed quiet for several breaths, arranging observations into a question. I asked Mother why she could read if books were so rare. Lena paused with a bundle of fever leaf between her fingers. The question surprised her. She set it aside and studied me as if choosing whether to answer a child or the mind she increasingly suspected existed behind my eyes. She said her mother had taught her because her mother taught her. The women in their family had kept herbs for Frostwood longer than she'd been alive. Healing couldn't depend only on memory. A person might remember a plant correctly for 20 years and still forget the proper measure on the day someone's life depended on it. Written notes didn't replace judgment, but they kept old mistakes from being repeated too easily. I asked if herbalists needed records. She said good ones did. Bad ones relied on confidence. Darren looked at Alara and said that sounded like her. She threw a folded cloth at him without looking away from the booklet. He caught it and looked pleased enough with himself that I suspected the whole exchange had been intentional. Lena continued as though cloth warfare between siblings belonged naturally inside serious discussions. Reading in Frostwood was practical rather than scholarly. People could read a little because the kingdom expected taxes, merchants expected accounts, and winter expected everyone to be less foolish than they'd been in summer. Reading wasn't the rare part. Books were rare. Time was rare. Teachers were rare. The kind of study that didn't immediately help keep a house warm or a family fed was rarer than all three. Gareth returned before the discussion faded. The door opened to wet air and heavy boots on wood. He entered with his cloak darkened by rain, split timber across one shoulder. He asked what he'd interrupted. Alara said I wanted to know why villagers could read, sounding like she'd personally discovered the question. Gareth looked at me, then at Lena, then at the booklet. He said being unable to read made merchants too happy. His father used to say a man who couldn't read a contract should bring someone who could or bring a club large enough to make the merchant honest. Since clubs caused trouble at market, he taught him letters. I liked Gareth's father immediately, though I'd never met him. I asked if he'd read books. Gareth said rarely. He preferred maps and trail marks. Books cost coin, and coin spent on books was coin not spent on salt, iron, arrows, or winter grain. My mother's family had writings because herbs killed people when fools trusted memory too much. Theirs had maps because hunters died when they trusted pride more than direction. The conversation lasted until the rain softened. Gareth spoke of his father teaching him route signs by carving symbols into bark. Lena told a story about her mother forcing her to copy plant names until her fingers cramped. I listened to all of it with the same attention I'd once given lectures and workplace instructions on Earth, except this was inheritance spoken aloud. The first clear sign of the invisible force came several days later while Lena prepared herbs for winter storage. I'd noticed hints before but dismissed them as childish sensitivity. That afternoon the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Lena had spread several plants across the table. Widow's thread drew my attention immediately. The purple vein running through each leaf was thin as stitched silk, with a faint metallic sweetness beneath its earthy smell. When I picked it up, something brushed the edge of my awareness. The sensation didn't belong to touch, smell, sight, or hearing. It reminded me of standing near a powerful machine and feeling vibration through the floor before hearing the motor, except this was subtler and not physical enough to locate in my skin. I set it down and the sensation faded. I picked it up again and the same faint pressure returned. I didn't react outwardly. While Lena arranged bundles, I tested quietly. Fever leaf produced nothing. Bitterroot only smell and texture. Silver moss carried a weaker version of the same sensation. The dark leaves Lena had warned me not to touch seemed stronger still. Lena noticed my stillness. I'd been holding the leaf for a long time. I said it felt different. Her hands paused slightly. Different how? I lacked language for it. Not like the others. She studied me, then picked up the same leaf between two fingers. After a moment she nodded. Widow's thread was stronger medicine than fever leaf. Some plants were like that. You had to treat them with more care. She believed I meant potency in the ordinary sense. I let her believe it. The forest made denial harder 2 weeks later when Gareth let me accompany a short inspection of the eastern trap line. He crouched in front of me and fastened a small cloak around my shoulders. He told me I'd stay where he told me, not run, not touch anything without permission, and if he said be quiet, I'd become quieter than I'd ever been. I nodded solemnly. He narrowed his eyes, suspicious of obedience delivered too quickly. That included questions. I asked how many questions. Lena laughed from the doorway before he could answer. The eastern forest smelled colder than the village. Gareth moved slowly at first, not because the path required it but because he wanted me to see where his feet landed. He avoided dead twigs without looking down, stepped on stones when mud would take prints, brushed branches aside gently instead of letting them snap back. I tried to imitate him and failed repeatedly. My boots found every loud leaf in the forest. He waited until we reached a fallen log before speaking. Asked what I'd learned. I said I was loud. He said I was honest at least. I said I'd been trying not to be. He said trying to be silent made children stiff and stiff feet struck hard. You listened to yourself instead of the forest, and the forest told everything nearby where you were. He pointed to impressions in the damp earth. 2 narrow marks, deeper at the front. A young thornbuck passed through at dawn. The spacing was short, the weight light. It had dragged one hoof slightly, meaning injury or burrs caught near the joint. The explanation hit me with unexpected pleasure. This was diagnostics, not hospital diagnostics or warehouse troubleshooting, but the same mental discipline applied to a living environment. Evidence existed. Patterns existed. A careful observer could reconstruct events from traces. Gareth called it hunting. I'd have called it analysis. At the second trap, the sensation returned. It gathered faintly around a patch of moss clinging to exposed stone near an old pine. The pressure felt similar to widow's thread but broader, as though the air itself had thickened by a degree too slight for ordinary senses. I slowed without meaning to. Gareth noticed immediately. I said the place felt different. He scanned the trees, not the moss. His hand moved closer to his knife. The shift was subtle but complete. He didn't treat unexplained discomfort lightly. I said it wasn't dangerous, then regretted the certainty because I didn't actually know. The third trap had been destroyed. We smelled it before we saw it. A sour animal musk hung low between the trees. Gareth stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into his leg. He raised one hand without looking back and I froze. Ahead, saplings had been snapped at uneven heights. The trap lay scattered in broken wood and bent metal. Deep gouges marked the soil. On a nearby tree, for claw marks had carved through bark into pale wood beneath, each groove longer than my forearm. The sensation returned with enough force to tighten my stomach. It saturated the clearing in broken currents, strongest near the claw marks. I felt it before I understood what I felt, the way you sense heat before locating the fire. Gareth crouched near the damaged trap but didn't touch it. His face hardened. We leave now. I asked what did this. He looked toward the trees beyond the clearing. Ironclaw unless something wanted us to believe it was one. The second half of that answer frightened me more than the first. I asked if something would fake that. He said most beasts didn't lie. Some monsters almost did. He guided me backward, placing his body between me and the deeper forest. They didn't run. Gareth had mentioned that running from predators often made decisions for them. They withdrew carefully. Several times he stopped and listened. Once he pulled me behind a tree and waited so long my legs began to ache. Nothing emerged. Only when the village fence came into view did his shoulders loosen. That evening, the village changed around the word Ironclaw. Hunters gathered near the storehouse. Gareth spoke quietly with Rowan one eye. An older hunter, tall, lean, gray-haired, scarred in ways that made children stare until their parents told them not to. One eye gone beneath a pale scar from brow to cheek. He listened to Gareth's report without interruption. Asked 3 questions I couldn't hear. His expression didn't change, which somehow made it feel worse. After dinner, while Lena checked stored bandages near the table, I chose my path carefully. I asked Mother how mages made fire without flint. She looked at me, then at Gareth, who was cleaning a knife near the hearth. He raised one eyebrow, recognizing his son's questions had found new hunting ground. Lena set down the bandage roll. Mages used mana. The word arrived quietly, fitting itself into the spaces between my observations until several separate mysteries shifted toward each other. I asked what mana was. She said it depended on who answered. A village herbalist would say mana was the power resting inside living things and places. A hunter would say monsters carried too much of it and ordinary animals carried less. A priest might say it was one of the creator's hidden laws. A scholar would use many more words and leave me less certain than before. Gareth snorted. That sounded like scholars. Lena ignored him with practiced ease. Most people couldn't see mana, and many couldn't feel it clearly. Mages were people born with the ability to sense and move it better than others, though training mattered too. Some used words to help shape it. Some used signs. Some used tools. The powerful ones could make fire, call water, strengthen bodies, mend wounds, harden stone, or worse things if they were cruel. Everything she described touched something I'd already noticed. The widow's thread, the silver moss, the storm deer antler, the patch of forest near the old pine, the ironclaw clearing filled with pressure like invisible residue. The word mana didn't explain the phenomenon, not truly, but it named it. And naming a thing mattered because names allowed questions to gather around the same point. I asked if plants had mana, some more than others. If medicinal herbs had more. Lena's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion alone but in interest. Often, though not always. Why? I chose my answer carefully. Some felt stronger. The room went quiet enough for the hearth to become loud. Gareth's knife stopped moving. Lena looked at me for several seconds. In her face I saw surprise, concern, and something like calculation. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss me. She asked if I felt that. I said sometimes. Gareth and Lena exchanged a look. I hated adult looks exchanged over my head, especially when I understood enough to know they were deciding how much truth belonged to me. At last Lena reached across the table and rested her hand gently over mine. Some children imagine things because stories made the world seem larger. Some children notice things adults had forgotten how to notice. She didn't know yet which kind of noticing this was, but I had to not speak of it carelessly outside this house. The warning carried no panic, which made it stronger. Gareth added that people became foolish around children who seemed unusual. Some praised, some feared, some tried to use. Best not to invite any of the three. I nodded. I understood more than they knew. Later that night, after the house quieted, I lay awake beneath my blanket and examined the day with the discipline Adam had once used on stubborn problems. Mana existed. The people of this world accepted it as fact, just as people on Earth had accepted gravity long before understanding space-time, used fire long before chemistry, navigated by stars long before astrophysics. Frostwood's knowledge of mana was practical, inherited, and incomplete. That didn't make it useless. It made it a beginning. If mana strengthened bodies, healed wounds, moved elements, and lingered differently in plants, beasts, and places, then it wasn't merely a mystical word. It was a phenomenon with behavior. Behavior implied patterns, and patterns implied rules, even if those rules were strange enough that Earth science couldn't contain them unchanged. I raised my small hand in the darkness, flexing fingers too young to hold a weapon properly and too weak to shape the future I imagined. For now, I had no teacher, no books, no tools, and no proof beyond sensations a cautious mother had warned me not to reveal. I had only memory, curiosity, patience, and a frontier village where survival left mysteries lying unnoticed in herbs, antlers, forests, and monster tracks. For now, that would have to be enough.